July 20th, 1944. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified command headquarters buried in the forests of East Prussia, a leather briefcase sat on the floor beneath a heavy wooden conference table. On the table above it, maps of the collapsing Eastern Front were spread out for review. Around that table stood a cluster of senior military officers and Nazi officials, leaning in to follow the briefing. And only a few feet from the briefcase stood Adolf Hitler himself. The man who had carried that briefcase into the room was Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German colonel who had lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers to wounds suffered during the North African campaign. Officially, he was there that day to deliver a report on the reserve army. In reality, the briefcase contained no documents at all. It contained explosives. Minutes after placing it beneath the table, Stauffenberg excused himself, claiming he needed to take a telephone call, and left the room. The briefing continued without him. Hitler leaned forward over the maps. Beneath the table, unseen by anyone, a timer kept counting down. Then the device detonated. The blast tore through the room in a wave of smoke, heat, and splintered wood. In Berlin, the small circle of conspirators waiting for word believed, for a brief window of time, that they had succeeded, that Hitler was dead, and the machinery of a new government could begin to move. Operation Valkyrie was set in motion. But within hours, a single piece of news reached them and brought the entire plan crashing down. Hitler had survived. This was far from the only attempt on his life. Over the course of his rule, Hitler was the target of more than 40 separate plots to kill him. Almost every one of them failed. Some failed by inches. Others failed by minutes. And one of them, a bomb smuggled aboard his own aircraft, failed for a reason so small, so mundane, that it is almost impossible to believe how close it came to changing the outcome of the entire war. This is the story of that chain of attempts told in the order they happened, and of the flight that Hitler was never supposed to survive. Chapter 1. 13 Minutes. The story begins in Munich, in November 1939, only weeks after the Second World War had broken out in Europe. George Elser was not a soldier. He was not connected to any military resistance circle, and he held no rank or title within the German government or armed forces. He was a carpenter, a skilled tradesman with no formal political power of any kind. And yet Elser had reached, entirely on his own, the same conclusion that would later drive far more powerful men to act. As long as Hitler remained in control of Germany, the country was going to be pulled deeper and deeper into a war that would cost countless lives. For Elser, this was not a sudden impulse or a moment of rage. He had thought it through carefully over a long period of time, and had come to believe that killing Hitler was the only realistic way to prevent an even wider catastrophe from unfolding across Europe. Having reached that conclusion, he spent months quietly preparing to act on it. His target was the Berger Braukeller, a large beer hall in Munich. Every year on the 8th of November, Hitler traveled there in person to mark the anniversary of the failed 1923 beer hall putsch, delivering a speech to loyal party members who gathered to commemorate the event. For Elser, this annual tradition offered something rare and valuable: a fixed location, a predictable date, and a schedule he could count on repeating. For weeks beforehand, Elser worked inside the beer hall, largely unnoticed, often at night, slowly hollowing out a hidden cavity inside one of the stone pillars near the podium where Hitler would stand to speak. Into that cavity, he placed a timed explosive device of his own construction, calibrated to detonate at a point in the evening when, according to the hall's usual schedule, Hitler would still be standing at the podium delivering his address. On the night of November 8th, 1939, everything unfolded almost exactly as Elser had planned. Hitler arrived at the beer hall as expected. The room was packed with party faithful. His speech began on schedule. And inside the pillar, the timer Elser had built continued its silent countdown toward the moment of detonation. Then the explosion came, tearing through the hall with tremendous force. The area around the podium was destroyed outright. Part of the ceiling collapsed under the blast. In the end, 63 people were injured and 7 were killed. But Hitler was not among them. Unknown to Elser, Hitler had cut his speech short and left the hall earlier than his usual schedule, reportedly because of poor flying weather that forced a change to his travel plans for the return journey. He walked out of the building at roughly 9:07 in the evening, just 13 minutes before the bomb inside the pillar finally went off. A plan that had taken months of careful, dangerous preparation to build had ultimately been undone by a gap of only 13 minutes. Chapter 2. The Bomb on Board. After the failed attempt in Munich, Hitler pushed Germany further and further into war, and at the same time, the possibility of getting close enough to threaten him grew steadily more remote. His schedule became a closely guarded secret. Every location he intended to visit was inspected and secured well in advance. Multiple layers of security surrounded him wherever he went. Even so, inside the German army itself, a small circle of officers had begun quietly searching for a way to oppose him from within the system rather than from outside it. One of the central figures in that circle was Henning von Treschow. Treschow had, in the earlier years of the regime, seen Hitler as a leader capable of restoring German strength and pride after the humiliations of the previous war. But that belief eroded steadily the longer he served on the Eastern Front. The brutality of the fighting there, Hitler's increasingly reckless military decisions, and the atrocities being carried out by the regime behind the front lines all convinced Treschow that Hitler was no longer leading Germany toward strength, but toward total disaster. In the spring of 1943, Treschow saw an opening. He persuaded his superior, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, to invite Hitler to visit Army Group Center's headquarters near Smolensk, where Treschow himself was stationed. Hitler agreed to the visit. On March 13, 1943, during a journey that would take him from the front back to his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler's aircraft made a scheduled stop at Smolensk. During a lunch held as part of the visit, Treschow approached Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Brandt, an officer who was scheduled to fly back to East Prussia aboard Hitler's own aircraft. Treschow asked Brandt for a simple favor, to carry a small package back to East Prussia on behalf of a mutual friend. The excuse he offered was casual and unremarkable. Treschow explained that he had lost a bet and owed the man the contents of the parcel. From the outside, the package looked exactly like a gift of liquor, commonly described afterward as resembling 2 bottles of brandy. Brandt suspected absolutely nothing. As far as he knew, he was simply carrying a bottle of alcohol for a friend of a friend. In reality, hidden inside the wrapping was a bomb fitted with a working detonator. Shortly before the aircraft was due to take off, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, one of Treschow's closest accomplices in the plot, quietly activated the device's timer fuse using a mechanism known as a time pencil. The armed package was then carried aboard the aircraft along with the rest of the luggage. At around 3 in the afternoon, the plane lifted off. On board were Hitler, Brandt, and, hidden among the ordinary baggage, the bomb. The device had been set to detonate roughly 30 minutes after takeoff. Schlabrendorf had started the countdown by crushing a small glass vial filled with a corrosive liquid inside the time pencil, a mechanism designed to eat through a restraining wire and trigger the explosion once enough time had passed. If everything worked as intended, the aircraft was expected to go down somewhere near Minsk. From the outside, investigators would very likely have concluded it was nothing more than a tragic aviation accident. But nothing happened. Hitler's aircraft reached his headquarters safely, with no sign of any problem during the flight. The explanation most widely accepted afterward is that the package had been stored in a cold section of the aircraft, and that the low temperature affected the chemical reaction inside the detonator, causing the timing mechanism to fail to complete its countdown as planned. In that instant, a failed assassination attempt became something even more dangerous for the men behind it, a direct and immediate threat to the entire resistance network. The package was still intact. The bomb had not exploded. If anyone opened it and discovered what was inside, Treschow, Schlabrendorf, and the wider circle of officers connected to them could all be exposed and arrested. Treschow had to respond immediately. He telephoned Brandt and calmly explained that he had accidentally handed over the wrong package, keeping his voice light and unconcerned, as though the whole matter were nothing more than a minor mix-up. The following day, Schlabrendorf flew to East Prussia himself. His task was to recover the package before anyone had the chance to discover what it actually contained. He met with Brandt, exchanged the dangerous parcel for 2 genuine bottles of liquor, and quietly carried the live device away with him. Only once it was safely back in his own hands did the resistance circle escape the immediate danger of exposure. Hitler never learned how close he had come that day to a plot that could have altered the entire course of history. Trescow's plan had failed, but he had not been caught, and the resistance still had another chance ahead of it. Chapter 3. The Failed Close Range. After the failure of the aircraft bombing in 1943, the resistance circle understood that it needed to find another method entirely. If they could not eliminate Hitler from a distance, using a hidden device planted somewhere near him, then they would have to find a way to get physically close enough to strike him directly. By late 1943, Claus von Stauffenberg had become one of the central organizers within the military resistance. At that stage, he was not yet the man expected to carry a bomb himself. His role was to help connect officers, opportunities, and plans across the wider network. The opportunity that eventually emerged came from something entirely routine: official presentations of new German army uniforms. These events offered a legitimate, unremarkable reason for officers to be standing near Hitler without drawing any suspicion at all. For the resistance, that created a narrow, dangerous window of opportunity. The first officer chosen to attempt an attack at one of these presentations was Axel von dem Bussche. He was a tall, striking German officer whose appearance closely matched the kind of idealized image Nazi propaganda often promoted, which made his presence at a formal uniform presentation seem entirely natural. Busch's motivation went beyond simple military disagreement with the regime's strategy. He had personally witnessed or learned of atrocities committed by the regime on the Eastern Front, and to him, Hitler stood at the very center of a system pushing Germany and the whole of Europe toward disaster. The plan built around Bussche was direct, and for him personally, almost certainly fatal. He would join the presentation as one of the officers modeling the new uniforms, and once close enough to Hitler, he would detonate a hidden explosive device, sacrificing his own life in the process in order to remove Hitler from power. The plan never reached that stage. A railway shipment carrying the new uniforms intended for the presentation was destroyed in an Allied air raid before it could arrive. Without the uniforms, the entire event had to be postponed. Later, Bussche was severely wounded while serving at the front and was no longer able to take part in any further attempt. The next officer selected for a similar mission was Ewald Heinrich von Kleist, a young officer willing to take on the same extraordinarily dangerous role. The underlying plan remained unchanged. Use a uniform presentation as a pretext to get close to Hitler, carry a hidden explosive device, and act at extremely short range. Kleist understood clearly that there would be almost no way for him to survive such an attempt, but he agreed to go through with it regardless, believing as strongly as Bussche had that Germany was sliding irreversibly deeper into catastrophe under Hitler's continued leadership. Once again, the plan collapsed before it could even begin. Hitler canceled the scheduled meeting at the last minute, for reasons unrelated to the plot, leaving no presentation to attend, no opportunity to get close, and no chance for Kleist to act. Then, on July 7, 1944, a third opportunity finally appeared. This time, the uniform presentation actually took place as scheduled. The officer expected to act on this occasion was Helmuth Stief, a senior officer with direct ties to the wider resistance network. By this point, the overall military situation had grown far more serious than it had been during the earlier attempts. In the east, German forces were being steadily pushed back by the advancing Red Army. In the west, Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy and were pushing inland. For a growing number of German officers, Hitler had by now become, in their eyes, the central reason Germany was moving inexorably toward total collapse. Stief had the opportunity to get close to Hitler that day. The physical distance was short, and the surrounding conditions were, by most accounts, more favorable than in many of the earlier attempts. But at the decisive moment, he hesitated, and he did not act. There was no explosion, no sudden shift in the balance of power. Hitler left the event safely, entirely unaware of how close he had once again come to danger. After this repeated chain of failures and missed chances, Claus von Stauffenberg reached a difficult conclusion of his own. He understood that he could no longer rely on someone else to carry out the act on the resistance's behalf. If there was still one real chance remaining to remove Hitler from power, he would have to be the one to take it himself. Chapter 4. Operation Valkyrie. By the summer of 1944, Germany's military position had deteriorated to the point of near desperation. In the east, the Soviet Red Army continued to push German forces steadily backward. In the west, Allied troops who had landed in Normandy were advancing further into occupied France. The war was now pressing in on Germany from both directions at once. For Claus von Stauffenberg, time had nearly run out. He had come to believe that if Hitler remained in power any longer, Germany's collapse would be total and irreversible. As a result, the plan he now committed himself to was no longer aimed only at killing Hitler. It was designed as the opening move of a broader military coup intended to seize control of the government in the immediate aftermath of his death. The central tool for that coup already existed within the German military bureaucracy, Operation Valkyrie. Originally, Valkyrie had been designed as a contingency plan, allowing the reserve army to restore order within Germany in the event of internal unrest or an uprising by forced laborers. The resistance circle around Stauffenberg quietly reworked that existing plan into a mechanism for seizing power in Berlin the moment Hitler was confirmed dead. If Hitler could be removed from command, the plan called for Valkyrie orders to go out immediately, directing loyal units to take control of key locations across Berlin, isolate SS forces from the regular army, arrest prominent Nazi officials still loyal to the regime, and begin forming a new government to negotiate an end to the war. Everything depended entirely on speed. The message confirming that Hitler was dead and no longer able to command needed to spread through the chain of command before any official denial could catch up with it and reverse the momentum. If even one link in that chain moved too slowly, the entire plan risked collapsing before it had truly begun. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg and his adjutant, Werner von Haeften, flew from Berlin to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Stauffenberg's official reason for the visit was to deliver a report on the reserve army, giving him a completely legitimate reason to be inside Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters that day. Concealed inside his leather briefcase were two separate explosive charges, both intended to be armed in order to maximize the chances of success. As soon as he arrived, however, the situation changed unexpectedly. The scheduled briefing was moved earlier than planned. Stauffenberg and Haeften stepped into a small side room to prepare the device, but were told they needed to hurry, leaving them with far less time than they had anticipated. Under that pressure, Stauffenberg was only able to arm one of the two charges before he had to move. The second charge was left behind, still unused, in Haeften's possession. Stauffenberg then entered the meeting room itself. It was not the sealed concrete bunker the conspirators had originally expected and planned around, where a blast would have been contained and amplified. Instead, it was a lighter, more open room with several windows. Inside, Hitler stood with a group of senior officers, all gathered around a large table covered with military maps. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase on the floor near Hitler, positioning it as close as he reasonably could beneath the conference table. He then excused himself, using a phone call as his pretext, and left the room entirely. In the few minutes that followed, one small, seemingly unimportant detail changed everything. Another officer in the room, apparently trying to get a clearer view of the maps, moved the briefcase slightly, shifting it to the far side of one of the table's heavy wooden support legs. Then the device exploded. The blast tore through the room, filling it instantly with smoke, splintered wood, and a shockwave of pressure. Several of the men present were killed outright or badly wounded in the explosion. From outside the building, Stauffenberg saw smoke rising above the wreckage and believed, understandably, that the plan had worked exactly as intended. He and Haeften left the Wolf's Lair immediately and flew back to Berlin to set Operation Valkyrie into motion. In Berlin, the resistance began issuing orders and mobilizing units, but they were forced to act on incomplete and increasingly confused information. Some orders went out. Some units began to move into position, but Hitler had survived. At the moment of the explosion, Hitler had been leaning forward over the map table, examining the details laid out in front of him. The meeting itself was being held in a bright, open conference room rather than the sealed underground bunker the plot had originally been designed around. And the briefcase, which in the end contained only one of the two armed explosive charges, had been shifted behind the heavy oak support leg of the map table only minutes before detonation. That thick wooden support absorbed and deflected a significant portion of the blast, shielding Hitler from the full force of the explosion. Operation Valkyrie could only succeed as a coup if every officer involved believed, without doubt, that Hitler was no longer able to command. The instant it became clear that he had survived, the entire foundation of the plan depended on collapse beneath it. Chapter 5. The Price of Failure. After the plot at the Wolf's Lair failed, the Nazi regime reacted with immediate and overwhelming force. Within hours, control of the situation shifted firmly back into the hands of officials loyal to Hitler. At the Bendler Block in Berlin, the building that had served as the operational center for launching Operation Valkyrie, Klaus von Stauffenberg, Werner von Haeften, Friedrich Albrecht, and Albrecht Merz von Quernheim were all overpowered by loyalist forces. That same night, all 4 men were executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the very building from which they had tried to coordinate the coup. What followed was an even wider crackdown across the country. The regime moved aggressively to identify and dismantle the resistance network inside the army, the civil government, and broader German society. Thousands of people were arrested in the weeks that followed. Many of them were brought before the People's Court, a tribunal that functioned less as a genuine court of law and more as a political weapon designed to crush any remaining opposition through show trials and rapid executions. Henning von Treschow, who had organized the aircraft bombing back in 1943, took his own life on the Eastern Front rather than risk capture, determined to protect the identities of everyone still connected to the resistance network. George Elser, the carpenter who had acted entirely on his own back in 1939, was executed at Dachau concentration camp in April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe finally came to an end. Every one of these plots ultimately failed, and their failure left behind one persistent, unanswerable question. If even one of them had succeeded earlier, could the entire course of European history have been changed? The weight of small details. Every plan to remove Hitler from power failed because of something small, a schedule that changed unexpectedly, a device that simply did not function as intended, a meeting canceled at the last moment, a single moment of hesitation at exactly the wrong time, or a briefcase moved only a few feet at the worst possible instant. No one can say with any certainty how history might have unfolded differently if even one of these plots had succeeded instead of failing. But taken together, this chain of attempts shows something clearly. Even from deep within a totalitarian regime built on fear, surveillance, and absolute obedience, there were people who tried, again and again, at enormous personal risk, to resist it from within. For the millions of victims of the war that followed, these efforts ultimately came too late to change what happened. But they still leave behind an important and lasting lesson about responsibility, about the weight of individual choice, and about the true cost of silence in the face of catastrophe.